Okay, let's get started. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Vera Bernard, Senior Field Marketing Manager for CrossKnowledge, and I wish you all very welcome to our fireside chat with Amber Cabral. Amber is an inclusion strategist, certified coach, writer, and speaker. And we are very happy to have her today for this chat with Ken Roden, our brand director for brand strategy. The topic today for this conversation is the importance of manager allyship in a human workplace. So before handing over to Ken, I'd like to ask you to share all the questions that you may have in the chat. Amber and Ken will do a Q&A session and try to answer all your questions at the end of their conversation. The floor is yours, Ken.
Great. Thank you, Vera. And Amber, thank you for joining us today. How's it going?
Pretty good. Good to be here.
Awesome. Very excited to have you here. If we could start, could you tell me and tell us, how do you define allyship and how does it relate to having an inclusive workplace?
I love this question because I think sometimes there's a little debate if allyship is the right word. Okay, so it is. The way I define allyship, process where someone with privilege and power seeks to learn about the experiences of a marginalized group of folks, develops empathy for those folks, and then looks for ways in their privilege to those marginalized people. So let me break that down just a little bit because there's a lot of layers in there. So the first part of allyship talks about the privilege and power seeks to learn about the experiences of someone else. That means the first thing you have to do is figure out what privileges do I have? Now you may be saying, I don't really have a lot of privilege. I grew up kind of tough. I'm working really hard to, grow my life, but we all have some privilege, right? Well, question I tend to ask my audience is, did you wake up this morning with hot, clean running water? Most of us, the answer will be yes. You woke probably also had internet access, which is how you're able to participate today, right? And so those are privileges. And so we all have some privilege and power, and getting some sense of awareness of that helps us to understand that there are folks that don't necessarily have that. And sometimes our privileges are our skin tone, or that we speak the language of our community, or that we have access to certain information, like whatever that might be. Think about the folks who don't have it. And then you think about, okay, how can I empathize with that? That means you have to get to know people. You have to understand their experiences. You have to get to know the types of things that they've had to navigate, so that then you can start to together come up with ways for you to serve as an ally, which might be something like making connections or providing resources or clearing a path, or it can be it can be dollars. It can be all kinds of things. And so I have a really robust definition for allyship because I think it's important to understand that there's so many layers for us to be able to show up and be impactful, but also for folks to understand it's not just about the person that's receiving the allyship and it being done well there, but it starts with us being willing to look at ourselves critically first, the best way for us to give.
Yeah. That's really powerful. And I think it's a good reminder. You're right. Privilege we might not even recognize. I think there's a few YouTube videos that have some people stand in a line and they say, did you wake up with clean water today, or clean water in a warm home today? Did you get to eat today? Step forward. Have you ever experienced this? Take a step back. And it shows you kind of where we all are starting at and create some perspective. I love that. One thing you talked about was empathy. And recently Gartner shared that HR leaders, 60% of them actually, said that in order for organizations to be successful, they need more empathetic and authentic leadership. And we think managers are really important as a lever for organizations to be successed. What role do you see allyship having as it relates to a manager's role, connecting those two concepts? So allyship as it relates to managers.
Yes, absolutely. So first things first, if you are a manager, you are in a servant role. So your objective needs to be figuring out how you can serve. And one of those ways is being an ally. So what that starts with is you recognizing you have the privilege of being a manager, right? So that's the first thing. Managers have access to other leaders. Managers have access to process. They make lots of decisions. They are intended to be in place to help make some of the best decisions so that the team can thrive. And so if you are in that role, automatically you have tons of power. You have tons of privilege that perhaps the folks up under you are not going to have the same way. getting to know the needs of your team. So that could be how folks work, that could be how they communicate, that could be what their learning styles are, that could be creating an environment where they can showcase their best selves, whether that's skill set wise or communication wise. All of those are things that as a man opportunity to ally for. And then we can even get into deeper layers. So I want to make sure that folks are connected to the culture. I want to make sure that whatever identity you're bringing into, we're being thoughtful about how, as a leader, and my group that I partner with as colleagues, other men as leaders are able to create spaces for that too. And a lot of opportunity to serve as an ally by first looking at the power you have as a manager that gives you that privilege. Then say, okay, how can I best partner and support my team? What is the best way for me to extend the privilege and power that I have as a manager to make sure that my team is able?
Yeah, I really like what you said just now about the manager's power. And one of the things that just stuck with me was the topic of culture. What are kind of some good, what's the good DNA of an inclusive culture that a manager could help influence or create?
Yeah, so one of the things you want to think about with culture first and foremost is safety. So psychological safety specifically is what we're talking about. So obviously we want people to be physically safe going into workplaces. But in addition to that, psychological safety, do I feel like I can take some interpersonal risk and share, my bright ideas and not be criticized or attacked? Do I feel like I can present new information and not have to worry about, any damage to my reputation if someone doesn't agree with it? And so creating that environment is really important. And sometimes leaders think they can just come into a room and say, hey, I'm trustworthy. I hope that you will see this as a safe space. And that's not really the way it works. In order to start to create some of that safe space, which impacts you have to start to ask questions. And one of the best questions that a leader can ask that can help shape a culture is, what can I do to make this space safe for you? How can I help environment where you can do your best work, where you feel like you can show up, where you are able to give and also receive feedback in a healthy way? And so I think when we're thinking about inclusive cultures, it's one where I have the psychological safety to show up. It means my leader has done the work of thinking about what that means for me. This I might come to the workplace with, that I may need some support with highlighting or sharing. Creating a space where I too can ask questions. I too can, request support. And so question asking, which ultimately kind of points back to like that feedback loop, is a huge, makes a company culture feel more inclusive to the people who work there.
So let me make sure I got it right. The question is, what can I do to make this a psychologically safe environment for you? Is that right?
Yes. So and you can make it even simpler. What can I do to make this space safe for you? Okay. How can I make this space safe for you? And so I encourage people, you can ask that to your teams, but you can also ask it to folks one-on-one, because sometimes people don't always feel like they can share openly. But I do encourage it to be a question that leaders, particularly managers, make a point to ask as they are thinking about creating a sense of accessibility and inclusiveness in the workplace, so that your staff has a way of being a participant in that.
Yeah. And so let's say we're able to achieve that. What's possible for teams that are inclusive, that are in a psychologically safe environment?
Well, a number of things. Like innovation is bigger. You see a lot more innovation. You also see a lot more growth of. So there's a lot of data that talks about how in inclusive cultures, folks feel like, I see other leaders that I can identify with. And so I feel more sharing my ideas, and I see my ideas go further. So there's data about that. There's also better access to talent. So in the year 2023, where they're going to work, we have a whole new generation entering the workforce right about now. And so as those young folks are looking at organizations and saying, will I ideas? Will I be able to bring, my uniqueness? Will I be able to bring my creativity? We want access to that, to a world where, AI is doing some of the things that we used to do with our brains. And so we need those young folks that have perspective and interest and intrigue. And so being attractive to talent, part of that. Other things that, the benefit of being an inclusive culture creates for you is that you have the opportunity to lead the way in industry. What happens is when you are designing with inclusion and equity at the center, your products are better. you're serving in a more equitable way. You're serving in a more ethically responsible way. And so your products and your sales and the impact there also shows up. So there are lots of benefits. It feels like a lot of work, I think, sometimes, but for the companies that are doing it really well, they see lots of impact for that.
Yeah, it really speaks to me, that idea of people coming from different backgrounds and perspectives, creating something better, more innovative, that serves more people. And to me, that's what really stands out of having a diverse and inclusive team. You hit on something that it's kind of always on my mind. I think sometimes people are hesitant or afraid even to kind of lean into trying to be an ally, or maybe they're intimidated in some way. What advice would you give to someone in overcoming that discomfort?
First things first, discomfort happens. You will not get out of the way of it. It is always going to occur. I have been doing this work for over 20 years. I am uncomfortable, like it happens. And so I think the first thing is to just acknowledge that like discomfort is just a part of growth. Like you're going to feel that, and just kind of having to push through and navigate it. That's the first recommendation I have. The other thing is you thinking about serving as an ally. Again, if you just have of your own privilege, try to figure out how you can connect and understand the group you're trying to. So that means, building empathy through learning folks' stories and building meaningful relationships and having a good understanding of like, what are the intercultural or aspects that person might be experiencing. And then you can even ask, is this a good way for me to support you? I think one of the big missteps I see allies make is oh, I can help you in this way, and doing this thing. And then the person receiving it is like, but wait, that's not exactly what I'm looking for. And so it can come across as saviorism. It can come across as not being considerate of the person that you really want to be an ally for, which is why that empathy piece is so important. And so I don't want to ever send the message that this is easy. I do want people, though, to be prepared both for the discomfort and also for the possibility that you could make a mistake. You can misstep along the way. And so knowing how to apologize and, secure the relationship. And I offer always a, kind of a formula for apologies. So if you're going, if you make a misstep, you do something that's, received differently than you intended, you can open with, I apologize for, moving forward, I will, which tells people, I know I broke it. Here's how I'm not going to break it going forward. And so I not seeing it as let me avoid the discomfort, let me try to do this in the easy way, is a better approach than, looking at it as expecting that discomfort is a thing that you're not going to encounter, and instead meet the moment with the right tools.
Yep. I'm thinking like, first things first, discomfort happens, like lean into it.
Yes.
And I think the other thing that really stood out to me is the idea that we're all human. And so if we're trying to grow, we're trying to get better, we're going to stumble sometimes, but it's about your intent. And I think also important what you said, to not generalize people or that you're trying to work with. Don't think you know what they're looking for, what they need. Actually have a conversation.
Yep. Those are super key.
I think that kind of leads well to a new book that you might have called Say More About That. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I absolutely can. So Say More About That. You see it over one of my shoulders here. Okay. This book is really aimed at trying to give people the tools to push back, challenge, and show up as allies for themselves and others. Right. And so the intention here with this book is that I started to notice with my first book, Allies and Advocates, that a lot of folks were saying, but what do I say? But how do I say it? Because everyone wants to get it perfectly right. So this book spends a lot of time telling folks there is no perfect, there is no perfectly right. You're going to stumble, and gives people the resources to navigate that, but also helps people to be resourced to be able to navigate even when it gets challenging. So it gives a lot of scripts. It gives a lot of recommendations for how to deal with things that we all kind of thing we want to share. So like power dynamics being an element, or how do I push back against an expert like my doctor, how do I get someone be being dismissive to hear me? How do I get over a circumstance where I'm always being interrupted, or I'm the only person that looks like me in the room? And so the intent is to try to resource some of those discomforting, that kind of discomfort that counter, so that they have a bit of language that you can kind of shape for you, but doesn't stop you from being an ally, doesn't stop you from pushing back and speaking up for yourself and for those around you.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, and it relates very heavily to the work that we've partnered with you on for our skill paths around allyship. So for those of you who are customers, encourage you to check it out. I've just completed that path, actually. It's phenomenal. So thank you for that. Kind of leaning into it, and as I asked this last few questions, I want to open up to the audience. If you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat and we'll pick them up. We've got some time set aside for that. What about someone who is maybe in a more, I will say, sometimes traditional work environment, and maybe they are someone who is a minority or from a marginalized group, whether it's visible or not seen?
Yep.
How do you recommend them approaching this? Because I feel like that might even be harder.
Yeah, I think the thing we have to always remember is that your uniqueness belongs to you. And so you're going to see it how you see it. And you should, like, our identities belong to us.
Yeah.
The other side of that is that people are perceptions and ideas, and often they're going to be wrong. So what I try to encourage folks to do as you're thinking about the ways to show up as an ally, as you're thinking about the ways to push back, take a moment and think about both sides of it. Right? Think about the good parts, think about the parts that are hard, think about the parts that you're not so excited about. But at least if you have a little bit of you could encounter, it makes it a lot easier to navigate through it. And then once you do that, you can start to kind of a few ideas and scripts around how you will address those, how you will maneuver in those spaces. And that's kind of the approach I take. If I know I'm going to, as an example, a new doctor's office, or if I know that I'm going to a city that I've never been to, that, I know the data says that I'm not well represented as an ID, what are some of the things that I'm likely to encounter, and how do I want to show up and meet the moment instead of being in the position of just kind of reacting? So I do think it's knowledge that we are all unique. We are all going to have, I show up as a Black woman everywhere I go, I can't turn that off. But I also want to be responsible, with the idea that sometimes, there are folks that are having the experience of, I've never encountered a Black woman before, and so I don't know that I necessarily think one is more important than the other, but I do think that there's a responsibility on both sides to think about how I can prepare to engage responsibly, how I can be okay if something happens that I don't love and know how to navigate through that. And then, lastly, how can I be receptive to feedback? How can I be receptive to being able to change my perspective or my approach or my, the way that I'm sharing my ideas so that we can move down the best path? Because most of the time, people are well-intended, and while good intentions don't grant forgiveness, we still have to actually apologize. Want to try to navigate the world as much as we can with mindfulness around, okay, this is probably not intentional. Let me try to give the space and grace for folks to flex. Okay, this is what I intended. I hope I can earn the space, to be able to give folks to give me the grace and flex. And so identity is incredibly important. You carry it, but we just also want to be mindful that everybody else is doing that too.
Yeah. It's interesting sometimes because, if you want to hear someone, you've got to listen with both your ears and maybe talk less.
Yes.
And then also, I just really am feeling what you're saying around what people don't know, they don't know. And we're all coming at it from our own experience and our own view. And it's not necessarily about you, but we got to kind of connect somewhere. So that's really powerful.
Yes, I think the best thing we can do is practice perspective taking. Put yourself in someone else's point of view, even if it's a point of view, right? Even if it's a point of view that you're not a huge fan of, it's a lot easier to navigate a conversation if I just say, okay, let me try to see it from your point of view, not a point of view I agree with. But if I try to see it that way, it makes it a lot easier for me to win at the conversation.
Yeah. And what can happen from that? What's the worst that could happen if you
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, the worst that can happen is that someone actually takes a moment and feels seen, so it's kind of a benefit all around. That doesn't mean, I think we also have to get over the ideas that allyship or equity or inclusion is always going to be a thing that we agree with. You may not love the most equitable solution. You may not love the most inclusive approach. You may feel like, oh, I think it would be easier for me if this were different. But we have to always be willing to step outside of ourselves, another perspective. I was watching a video, probably on TikTok the other day, and, it was talking about how, there was this kind of game going on where one of the team members, there were two team members, and one of the team members had double everything. They started out with double the money. They started out with double the dice to roll, double the amount of property or whatever it was. And then the other person that had half, very able to see like, okay, the game is set up. I'm not going to win. They still tried, because this was a, kind of part of the test. But the other person who had double, all see that they didn't earn that advantage, that they were just given it. And so that's why sometimes we have to, even in our own minds, be willing to say, maybe this person just doesn't, that there's inequity here. Maybe this person just isn't able to acknowledge that, because when we're steeped and rooted in our own privilege, and most of us don't think a lot about our own privilege, we can miss the benefiting, and we can be resources, and that we may be looking at folks with a really critical lens. And until someone tells us, we won't correct it. And so I just think there's a bit of responsibility we have around inclusion and equity that requires us to not just think of ourselves when we enter a space, but to also think of others, even when it's not ideas we love, just because it'll help us to navigate the conversations better.
Yeah. Going back to one of the things you said earlier around Gen Z and just new workers coming in, and then thinking about this concept of hearing people from where they're at so they feel part of something, and that people over here might have a privilege, who are already in the office, already have ground to stand on, have an advantage, they might not see it. I feel like that's where the friction is for the future of work. And I just read that 73% of CEOs are worried about their workforce. And the survey said, like, well, what do you mean by that? They're like, I don't know how we're going to retain or even attract talent anymore. And when you hear Gen Z say why, it's like, I don't feel heard. I don't feel like you're aligning to my values. I don't feel like I'm going to have a good foot in the door. I feel like it's already hierarchical. So I think
it's all culture stuff. It's all culture stuff.
Yeah, you're right. It's not about the work itself. It's about the people you work with and how the culture is defined. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, it's a lot. I actually have a person that is a member of Gen Z, and she said to me one day, she had come by, we were sitting in the office working on a project, and as she was passing, I was like, yeah, I have no intentions on ever working in a corporation. And I was like, well, I'm a company, I'm a small company, but I am a company. And she's like, no, I mean, in a corporate office, that's what I was trained for. That's what my degree is in. But I'm never going to do that, because I don't feel like I'll be valued. I don't feel like I'll be supported. And what I've seen doesn't feel like I'm being thought of in terms of what's going to be best for my growth and development, so that I can make the impact that I'm put here to make. So, I mean, we do have to think a lot about, what does allyship look like? What does inclusion look like? What does equity look like? We have to start thinking about that now, because you are not going to have access to the next generation of talent. And one of the things people don't realize is happening is that we're also in the midst of one of the largest wealth transfers. So all of us generationally that have been in the workforce, we've been saving. We've been making sure our kids don't have to do what we've done to make money. We've been making sure that our kids are put in positions where they can make decisions we couldn't. So a lot of these young folks don't have to work the way we did. And so what does that mean for the future of work? What does that mean for corporations who really need the talent? It's going to be a real competition, and what your culture is doing is going to be a huge part of that. And so I think the conversations that we're having now around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how allyship in that are going to ultimately be critical to helping organizations survive.
Yep. And it's here now, and the problem is just going to get worse if we don't try to solve it. And I think what you're saying is really powerful. People on this call are HR and learning and development leaders, and learning is the way to get past these struggles by helping people educate themselves, bringing them along for the ride, so that they're thinking about these things. But this could be a huge talent disruption if young Gen Z talent's not coming to work in corporations, and we've got boomers retiring now. This could cause a ripple effect that could take down some businesses, large businesses, if they don't think about the repercussions.
Absolutely. There's been a lot of conversations lately around is DEI still important? Is DEI dying? Is this, thing really working, that we've been investing in? And I always am amused by that, because, as long as there are people, we're going to need to talk about what equity looks like, and so As long as we're evolving, we have to think about that. And to your point, it's going to become increasingly more important what equity looks like in the workplace, because folks are going to have more choices. It's a lot easier in 2023 and beyond to build a business. It's a lot easier to learn things really quickly. And now we've got this whole AI revolution happening. I mean, people are out the gate figuring out how to use that. And so if we aren't really thoughtful about what our businesses, not just are doing from a product standpoint and how we're impacting the environment and the folks that are working at our organizations, like in the future that way, but also like what talent is or to help us get there, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Like, because folks are just not willing to put up with, the old days of like, do it because I said it and I'm the boss. It doesn't work that way anymore.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I was in an interview with a candidate, and they asked, "What are you doing around DE&I?" And I was like, "Oh, well, we've got employee resource groups, we've got candidate advocacy, and all these different programs going." And she said, "No. What are you doing about DE&I as my manager? How do you think about an inclusive workforce, essentially?" And we had to have a conversation about it. And she was like, "Well, here's what I'm looking for." And I mean, this was an early career professional who was like, "This is what I'm looking for in a company." And I was, it was definitely a learning opportunity for me. And I think we're just going to see that more and more, especially with people being able to start their own careers without a company. Like, start their own business. It's all on TikTok. It's AI can generate blog posts for you. They don't need us the same.
Yeah, it's very different. I also think, kind of to that end, like I always give people a couple questions they can ask themselves, like just to be able to answer exactly what you said is, how does diversity, equity, and inclusion come to life here? So whatever you're doing, whatever the work is, if you cannot identify how those things are coming to life in it, it's possible it's not. And then the other thing is, how might someone who is different than I am receive this? How might they see it? Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, at least having awareness of that can help us prepare for how we need to communicate things going forward, whether that's to our teams or even to our consumers. And so those two questions alone can help you to be intentional about making sure that you can answer questions like that from what are you doing?
Amber, if I may cut in here. So we have a question from the audience. So very important part of leadership. And after 23 years in a global company as a leader, I would ask, how do you make leaders really feel the fun and being authentic in their interaction with their teams facing political challenges on the other end every day?
Yeah, so political challenges is always an interesting one, because that's one of those, depending on where you are in the world. So the thing I always encourage people to recognize is that equity is not a political matter. And so what you want to be always able to do is be intentional about finding the most equitable solution, because then you can explain why. For example, you see a logo right here. All right. I chair an organization called Brown Girls Do Ballet. Now you hear two identities really called out specifically, right? Brown girls. Okay. That's who we focus on. That's who we are really intentionally trying to support. Now, does that mean that we do not want to see, male or, gender non-specific ballerinas? No. Does that mean that we are opposed to folks who are not brown? No. But it does mean that we are focusing here, and we can explain why. So we don't see enough representation for brown ballerinas. We actually also notice that it's harder for them to get shoes that are in their skin tone. It's also a lot of struggles that they face in terms of body shape and size, because people who are from multicultural backgrounds are shaped differently than people who are more Eurocentric. And so all of those things play a part into how folks are experiencing the dance world. And so our focus is there. That means the role for folks that are not necessarily in that group, the opportunity they have is to support brown girls, right? They can have conversations, they can be resourced, they can participate in ways to kind of highlight some of the things that are going on. So I think we have to be really deliberate about understanding what equity might look like. And in the moment, feel like, but you're only focused on this group. How is that equitable? That you can explain why it's important that we do it this way, what the differences are, because then people can. That's the trick. Now, whether it's going to be fun or not, it kind of depends on the topic. I do think you can always bring authenticity as long as you're about what the subject matter is, and you can say, here is our focus area. This is why this is important. And by No way are we saying, we do not allow boys to apply for scholarships, or we do not allow, white folks to apply for any of our grants. That's not the case. Do is make sure that we make it visible who we're focused on and why. So it's easy for me to be very authentic around the topic. And then other folks can start to see the ways they can support. I think as a leader, we've got to be a bit strategic around how we approach and not necessarily see it as a thing that has to always feel really good. But politics do play a part, and that can make it a little bumpy depending on where you are in the world, for sure.
Yeah. I really love that we ended on that question. Thank you so much, Amber, for your time. This has been incredibly insightful. I loved this conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation as well. Thanks for joining.
Thank you to everyone. Have a nice, enjoy your day. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Amber.